Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to Conversations on Care, a Facebook talk show bringing together healthcare service providers, our clients, our caregivers, to help families better understand and cope with aging parents with chronic care needs. My name is Julie Collada, and I am the founder and president of Open Arms Solutions. And Open Arms Solutions is a home care agency serving the Chicagoland area, focusing on inspired home care solutions for seniors with chronic conditions such as dementia, Parkinson's, and other movement disorders. It is truly our mission to help families through this journey and to know that their loved one is living their best life possible. So thank you for all who have been watching over the year and a half, maybe almost 2 years that we've been doing this show. And thank you for sharing. Our audience has grown, and we really love to get this information out to more and more people who need it. If you have questions or topics you'd like to learn more about, please write them in the comments below, because we love to hear from you all. With me today is Mollie Whitehead, who is a partner at WhiteheadFink Elder Law, LLC. And our topic today is what families should know about Medicaid planning. Welcome, Mollie. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Julie. It's nice to be here with you.
Thank you. So, Mollie, tell us, what led you on your path to become an estate planning attorney?
Sure. Well, I a little bit fell into it by accident. So in law school, I had no idea what kind of law I wanted to practice. And just in taking different classes, I really came to be interested in estate planning. So wills, trusts, and then handling people's estate, often in court. And then after I graduated, I started working for a small firm in Chicago that did not only those things, estate planning and estates and trusts, but also elder law, which included Medicaid planning. So I really didn't know anything about Medicaid planning when I first started actually working on the cases. I learned from a paralegal in that office, and I learned from going to seminars, and then just actually preparing Medicaid applications and Medicaid appeals and going through the planning with clients. So I really learned on the job. It was, but it's worked out, and I've been doing this kind of planning now for about 15 years.
Oh my gosh. Well, I guess I would say it has worked out. So.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly important service that you're providing. Since I've been in this industry now for 15 plus years. And I also kind of got here by accident. I was not in this world until I had a personal experience with my mom, mm-hmm. who had all of a sudden really had some mini strokes and just had a sharp decline in her cognitive ability. And so all those questions about, how are we going to make decisions for mom? And popped up. So that kind of led me to this world, and I'm incredibly grateful that I'm here now. Let's I think often a question that I get, I know you get, and healthcare professionals get, is what is the difference between Medicaid and Medicare? And
sure.
Why we start there?
Yeah. So, a lot of people are familiar with how Medicare works. It's a health insurance plan that's run by the federal government. Any American who's over 65 is able to sign up for it. It covers doctors and hospitals and certain medications. And then some people get supplemental plans to cover, what's not covered. So most people are familiar with how that works. Medicaid is similar in some ways in that it's also a federal health insurance plan, but it was really created to cover people who are essentially impoverished. It was meant to cover people who either had never worked because of a disability or just were never able to hold a job, or, whatever their life circumstance, they really just didn't have much. And so it was meant to cover them. And in more recent history, a big component of Medicaid has become covering long-term care expenses. And a lot of people that I encounter, a lot of clients, just don't realize coming into this world of long-term care and elder planning that Medicare doesn't pay for that. I mean, it does pay for it in short periods of time, especially following like a hospital stay. Yeah. But just in general, Medicare does not cover long-term care. So if a loved one needs to, go into assisted living, or if a loved one needs to have a full-time caregiver, that is not something that's covered by Medicare. And instead, that's where we start getting into the Medicaid planning realm.
I can't tell you how many times over the years we sit down with families and, we talk to people about our services. And, and often the assumption is, and we're a home care company, right? We provide caregivers, in some cases nurses, that go into the home and help people with their activities of daily living and allow them to stay well and safely and independently in their own homes. And how many times people are floored that Medicare doesn't cover that. So that is and it got me it led me to a presentation I give from time to time called I Thought Medicare paid for that.
Yeah.
Because that was that is we keep hearing that over and over again. So trying to educate people and make them aware of that so they can do the appropriate planning. I know that's important to both of us. We talked about that a little bit as we were preparing for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's always, I don't know, I find it a little bit heartbreaking every time that I have to tell a family this, that actually this is the system in this country. You have to either have long-term care insurance to pay for this, which most people just don't have. It's expensive, and it's something that you would have had to have started doing a long time before. Or you have to have kind of a lot of money. I mean, private pay for 24-hour care is expensive. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. And so a lot of families find themselves in a situation where they're saying, well, I don't have either of those things. So how do I pay for that? And so that's where, we come in to kind of explain what options there are to figure out if there are ways to get this person on Medicaid. And sometimes that involves doing some planning, asset preservation planning, kind of depending on their situation and their assets and their family.
When should families start to think about that? When should families start to think about doing that planning? When is the best time?
Right. Well, in an ideal world, the best time is really when you're relatively young, because if you're going to look into like long-term care insurance, you have to do it like in your 40s or 50s, as crazy as that sounds. But most people don't. And so most people who come to see me are at kind of a crisis point. But it's really best to plan before the crisis. So I would say, at the very least, if you haven't already looked into long-term care insurance in your younger years, before you get diagnosed with something like dementia or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. So even like if you're in your early 60s and pretty healthy, like just start to look into it, have a conversation with somebody, because there are, some planning techniques that can be done, but they need to be done relatively early to maximize, how many of your assets that you can save. But most families come to me at crisis point. So that means, mom or dad has fallen and they're in the hospital or they're in rehab, and the family's trying to figure out whether that person is going to be able to come back home. And if they can't, well, then how are they going to pay for that? So, again, early planning is always better. And I always encourage that when I do estate planning with healthy people in their 50s or 60s or 70s, I always say, okay, have you thought about this at all? Do you have powers of attorney in place that can help deal with this type of situation if and when it happens? So I really do encourage early planning.
Yeah, that is, we both know from our experience how important that is. Right. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of power of attorneys and getting that established before that event happens?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really vital. So the reality is, with people living so much longer now, just the typical case, somebody in their late 80s or in their 90s, oftentimes that person is not able to make financial decisions for themselves any longer. And people just don't realize that their spouses can't necessarily handle all that for them without documentation in place. So for example, I meet with clients all the time where the spouses assume that they'll be able to access each other's retirement accounts if they need to. So if you have an IRA, by law under the tax rules, that can only be in your name. That is not joint with your spouse. And your spouse actually can't access it at all if they don't have a power of attorney. The only other way to access an account like that is to go to court and get guardianship. And trust me, because we also do guardianship, that's not something that you want to have to do.
And explain what that means. Yeah, you're right, but help people understand.
Yeah, so guardianship is when someone is not able to make decisions for themselves any longer, whether financial decisions or medical decisions or both, and there's no power of attorney in place already to, which would have named someone to make decisions. You have to make powers of attorney while you're competent. You can't do it later on. So if there's no document in place, then the family sometimes has no choice but to go to court. So they have to hire an attorney like me to go to court and petition for one of the family members, or sometimes a bank or other institution, to become guardian of that person. And guardianships are intrusive. I mean, you're basically in a situation where the court is now going to make all of the financial decisions. And they're just hard on families. Sometimes a parent or aunt and uncle or whatever the case is, they don't want a guardian, but sometimes it's unavoidable. So I always recommend to my clients that, having this pretty straightforward document is better than doing any of that in the future. It's just very clear to me that, it's better for the family. It's better for the individual. Nobody wants to go to court if they don't have to.
Yeah. Hope everybody listening seeks, hears that and takes advantage of this really great advice by Mollie, because I've seen it happen too often. The strain and the stress of having a court, and the cost, not to mention the cost, to have to hire an attorney, and all those things could really be preventative with some really good proactive measures.
Yeah.
So, let's talk a little bit about qualifying for Medicaid. I mean, First of all, what are because there's an asset number qualification, and then there's an income, right?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that.
So the rules are different depending on if you are applying for long-term care Medicaid or if you are applying for in-home Medicaid. Unfortunately, in-home Medicaid doesn't cover very much when it comes to long-term care. So, of course, everyone would rather stay in their homes, hire caregivers like those provided by Open Arms. Everybody would prefer that. And for those who are lucky enough to be able to fund that, that's usually what they do, right? But the reality is that not everyone can afford that, or even if they can afford it for a while, sometimes they can't afford it long term. So Medicaid is what we look to in those situations. And unfortunately, under our current structure of caregiving in this country and the rules for it and the ways we pay for it, unfortunately, Medicaid doesn't cover much in terms of in-home care. So most of the time, what I'm dealing with is long-term care Medicaid applications, and that's for people who need to go into assisted living or skilled nursing home. Whatever the circumstances, they are not remaining in their home anymore. So, I don't deal much with in-home Medicaid applications. Most of what I do is long-term care. So I'm going to talk about the qualifications for that because that's, what my practice focuses on.
Great.
So for long-term care Medicaid, you do have pretty strict rules about assets. The income is a little bit more complicated, and I'll get into that in a minute. For assets, if you are a married person, so your spouse is still living, your spouse, so if I'm the applicant and I'm married and I need to go into assisted living, my spouse is allowed to have up to $109,000 plus the home, which isn't much, right? I mean, the spouse has to live the rest of their lives, and that's what they're allowed to have. But some of my clients who come in, they already fit under those qualifications. So we just kind of give them tips on applying and what to expect and things like that. Other people who come in will have a married couple situation, and they will have significantly more assets. So then we'll talk through, okay, well, what are some ways that you can spend those assets to benefit you, or what are some other planning techniques that you can do to try to preserve some of that money? There are some ways to do it. A lot of it depends on the timing and the situation. If you are a single person, if you are not married, or if your spouse has passed away, then you cannot have more than $2,000 in assets if you want to get on Medicaid. So obviously that's, basically very little. Yeah. So when we have clients who come to us who do have some assets, we again will go through, okay, what are some ways that you can spend this money and still qualify and still get on Medicaid? And what are kind of the smartest ways to use the money that you have left? Or are there any opportunities to preserve some of the money that you have left? So that's kind of what we go through with clients in those situations.
Great. So
in terms of income, what happens when somebody goes on Medicaid is that all of their income, if they are a single person, is expected to be paid to the facility that they go into. So whether it's assisted living or skilled nursing, their income goes to that facility and reduces the amount that Medicaid will pay to that facility. So that's what happens with a single person's income. Married person's income is much more complicated. I'll try to simplify it. Basically, there is a threshold amount that the spouse is allowed to keep, whether from their own income or whether from their spouse's income. They're allowed to keep a threshold amount, which is $2,739 a month, which for some people, that's not a lot of income to be, having every month. So they're allowed to keep that. And then anything over and above that, which belongs to the applicant in terms of income, has to go to the facility. So a little bit complicated.
Yeah, it is. If you can do, though, planning in advance, because there's things like look back periods. And why don't you just share a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
And the advantages of doing some advanced planning.
Yeah. So I'll give you an actual situation that I've had in the past, which I think is a good illustration. So I had a husband come and see me, and he was relatively young. I want to say he was in his late 60s, perhaps. and his wife had early onset Alzheimer's. And, obviously a very sad situation. But he was very concerned because, he had worked his whole life. Him and his wife had worked their whole lives. They always wanted to be able to leave, their savings, what they had worked for, to their kids and grandkids. So he was looking for ways to be able to do that with the reality that his wife is going to need expensive care for most of the rest of her life. So we talked through a plan where he would essentially make gifts of a good chunk of their assets to his two sons, who he 100% trusted, who he, has a great relationship with, no issues there. While retaining enough to be able to pay for his wife's care with his help. He was her primary caregiver, but he had some help in the home as well. So he had to plan to be able to do that for 5 years. And then once that 5 years was up, he could then apply for Medicaid for his wife. She would then most likely move into a skilled nursing facility at that time. In the meantime, the couple's kind of life saving, most of their assets would be passed to their kids and then later to their grandkids. So that's one example of kind of planning ahead. And, if that same husband had come to me years later when, he didn't have the option to keep his wife in the home for 5 years, then that wouldn't have been possible. So again, being proactive, anytime that anybody gets a diagnosis that, the reality of it is that care is going to be needed. Yeah. It's really a great idea to just go talk to someone. I mean, we're not talking about committing to something. We're just talking about getting the information, yes. Educating yourself.
Yes. Yeah. Really important point. Explain to everyone watching, because I think this is something that's important for people to understand. Two, your example was great. It's also important to do research and understand that not every long-term care facility accepts Medicaid.
Yeah. So most assisted living facilities, which are, a lesser level of care than skilled nursing or what people think of as nursing homes. Mm-hmm. There's some support. They obviously are providing meals. They're providing, making sure the person is safe, mm-hmm. Providing activities and socialization and things like that. Mm-hmm. So assisted living, most of those facilities, at least in the Chicagoland area, are going to be private pay only. However, there is a category of assisted living here in Illinois called supportive living facilities. Yes. Uh-huh. And all of those facilities, they were constructed in a state and private joint plan. All of those facilities accept Medicaid. So if you go into a supportive living facility, even if you have some money to begin with and you spend it down, you will be able to go on Medicaid if you stay there. And then in terms of skilled nursing facilities, which is a higher level of care, somebody needs much more, medical intervention and support. There are facilities that are private pay only. They tend to be very nice places. And there are also many facilities that are both private pay and Medicaid. Some of those places are very nice and you're going to get high quality of care. Some of those places you have to be careful about because that's just the reality of it.
Yes.
And I also want to say something else with regard to the example that I gave about the husband. Mm-hmm. I don't in any way advocate that people shouldn't use their money on themselves if that's what they're wanting to do. I just want to make that clear. I'm not the type of attorney who says you have to preserve your money for your kids or your grandkids. I think that's a personal decision that every family has to make and that every parent has to make for themselves. So I support my clients if they say, well, I earn this money, it's mine, and I'd rather stay in my home and have private caregivers for as long as possible, then that's what you should do. I'm not somebody who says you must preserve this money, you must pass it on to your kids. It's a personal decision that every person has to make.
Well, thank you for saying that, Mollie. And that's, in my opinion, the right view to take for people. It's up to them, and everyone's decision and circumstances are so different.
Right.
So I really appreciate that. I think the other thing, I think you're right. And as people start to think about this and do planning, it might be interesting for you to do. I'm sure everyone has a lot of other things and more fun things to think about, but just to get an idea of, in long-term care, providers who provide, accept Medicaid. And I think that because I know families have been so surprised, always thinking, if my mom or dad needs this, they can go there. And it's just all about education and understanding options in advance, so there's not this surprise. That's really rarely very good when that happens. So you talked about some strategies to preserve assets, right? So you gave a great example of gifting things away. Can you think of any other strategies that you've seen people use that are helpful for people to know about?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things that are good to know about is that there are some exceptions under the Medicaid laws that allow for transfers under certain circumstances. So, for example, if you are a child who has moved into your parents' home in order to care for them, in order to help keep them in their home for as long as possible, the state rewards you with a special rule that says that a child caregiver can have that home transferred to them without any kind of penalty if they've been living there for 2 years. You have to be able to prove that you've been there for at least 2 years. You have to be able to prove that you've been taking care of mom or dad. And we do that with affidavits. And you have to have a doctor's affidavit that said that, yes, in fact, if this child hadn't been living there, then this person would have needed, institutional level care much earlier. But it's a great rule. We use it all the time in our planning because, especially in Chicago, I think, with people having 2 flats and, children very often will move into their parents' home and help take care of them. So it's something that we use very commonly to preserve the home.
That's great.
And then another kind of planning technique that we use regularly is something called a Medicaid compliant annuity. This gets into really complicated planning, so I'm just going to very briefly summarize how this works. So in some cases where there's a living spouse, we're able to convert the assets that put them over the eligibility threshold into an annuity. So we're giving the healthy spouse more income, and we're at the same time allowing the applicant to be able to get eligible for Medicaid faster. So it's kind of a win-win. I mean, annuities certainly have their downsides, but in terms of having no other good options, it's a good option.
Yeah.
And then we also are able to do some gifting to children in certain circumstances, along with the Medicaid annuity to pay for the penalty that will result for the gift, because the gift is within the 5-year look back period. So it does get pretty complicated in terms of how all of that works. This is probably not the right forum to try to explain it in, but just to kind of give you an idea of what other planning asset protection techniques are available.
And it also just reinforces how important it is that you have an elder care attorney that has this information and that you trust, and to, seek them out, Don't wait till you're in your 60s and your 70s, seek
Right.
them out earlier. There's a question that came from the audience. I want to make sure, because we're
Okay.
running short on time, that we get to it. It said, can Medicaid pending status prevent someone from qualifying for a Medicaid bed at a skilled nursing facility or supportive living facility?
So what that means, what they're talking, Medicaid pending means that you have submitted a Medicaid application, but it has not yet been approved. And the general answer is no. So typically what will happen is the person will go into a facility, whether assisted living or skilled nursing, and then they will submit an application for long-term care. If you are already in that facility under the law cannot kick you out just because your application is pending for Medicaid. However, if you're not yet in the facility, it is very common that facilities do not want to accept people who are Medicaid pending and don't have any private pay. So say that, my elderly mother is still living at home and we say, oh, you know what, we're running out of money, or she can't live here safely anymore, whatever the case is, we want to get her into assisted living or skilled nursing. We're going to apply for Medicaid now and then hopefully be able to get her in somewhere. It's not going to work great like that. I'm not saying you're not going to be able to find anything, but facilities want you to have some private pay when you're going in, or they want you to already be there. Typically people will be transferred to a rehab facility from the hospital if they've had a hospital stay. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to get in having no money and not yet on long-term care Medicaid. It's just not a lot of facilities want to take people under those circumstances. It's not impossible, but it's hard.
Right, and the facility has they're assessing a perceived risk.
Yeah, and facilities have their own perspective on things. One of the things that clients often will tell me is like, well, this is what the facility said. Well, they want to maximize how much private pay they're getting. Most of those places are for profit. And that's okay. I mean, I'm not saying that that's wrong of them, but I'm saying, you have to be careful to make sure that the applicant is getting advice from someone who has the applicant's best interest in mind.
100%.
Right.
So thank you for whoever submitted that question. We are flat out of time. Mollie, thank you so much. You did a great job, gave great examples, and it's such an important topic. I think Mollie's information is in the chat section, so please reach out to her and her firm if you have questions. If you're someone that's watching and you have a loved one, or you've just started to think about it, and pick up the phone and call and get some really, really, really solid advice.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks for having me. And I appreciate our networking relationship and talking through these issues that we both have to deal with all the time.
Me as well. All right. Take good care. Stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
Bye now. Thank you.
Bye-bye.